On Tuesday, February 17th, 2026, at approximately 0900 hours Geneva time, something happened that had never occurred before in the entire history of U.S.-Iran diplomatic negotiations. As Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi sat down in a Geneva conference room with Omani mediators to begin the second round of nuclear talks with American representatives, Iranian state television simultaneously announced that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps had fired live missiles into the Strait of Hormuz and was closing the waterway for several hours. The missiles, according to the semi-official Tasnim news agency, which is directly linked to the Revolutionary Guard, were launched from inside Iran, along its coastline, and from Iranian islands, striking targets inside the Strait of Hormuz. This was not a coincidence. This was not a scheduling error. For the first time since the United States began threatening Iran with military strikes over its nuclear program, Tehran had physically closed part of the world's most critical oil choke point. 20% of global oil supply passes through Hormuz. Iran chose the precise moment its diplomats were shaking hands in Geneva to fire weapons into the passage through which that oil flows. This is the story of how Khamenei turned a diplomatic table into a war room, how Iran used peace talks as cover for its most aggressive military demonstration in years, and what it means for 20 million barrels of oil that must flow through Hormuz every single day. The choreography of Tuesday's events was too precise to be accidental. The IRGC had announced military exercises in the Strait of Hormuz on Monday, February 16th, the day before talks were scheduled to begin. According to Euronews, the exercises were announced specifically on the eve of the Geneva negotiations. The drills, overseen by IRGC Chief General Mohammad Pakpour, were described as aimed at preparing the guards for potential security and military threats in the strait. Iranian state-run TV stated the drills would bolster rapid reaction capability. But the timing of actual missile firings, coinciding with the exact moment Foreign Minister Araghchi entered the negotiating room in Geneva, transformed what might have been routine exercises into something deliberate and calculated. Intelligence analysts in Washington, London, Tel Aviv, and Riyadh immediately recognized the dual-track nature of what Iran was doing. In Geneva, Araghchi was telling Omani mediators that Iran had real ideas for achieving a fair and equitable deal. In the Strait of Hormuz, simultaneously, Iranian missiles were demonstrating exactly what it would cost the world if that deal failed. Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei had telegraphed this approach in statements made in the days preceding Geneva. According to PBS News and multiple AP reports published Tuesday morning, Khamenei had stepped up his warnings to the United States over its military buildup in the Middle East. His exact words, reported by Iranian state media, carried unmistakable weight. Of course, a warship is a dangerous apparatus, but more dangerous than the warship is the weapon that can sink the warship into the depths of the sea. America had deployed USS Abraham Lincoln and was sending USS Gerald R. Ford to the region. Khamenei was telling Washington that carriers could be sunk. He was saying this while his foreign minister prepared to negotiate in Switzerland. That combination of diplomatic engagement and explicit military threat reflected a negotiating doctrine that analysts have studied in Iranian foreign policy for decades. Show the adversary exactly what it will cost to refuse your terms, then sit down and talk. The Geneva talks represented the second round of indirect negotiations mediated by Oman. The first round took place in Muscat on February 6th and 7th, 2026, where White House Special Envoy Steve Witkoff met with Omani Foreign Minister Sayed Badr al-Busaidi. Those talks produced no breakthroughs. Iran resisted American demands to halt uranium enrichment and hand over its 400-kilogram stockpile of uranium enriched to 60%, material that IAEA Director Rafael Grossi had stated could be further enriched to weapons grade in a matter of weeks. On Monday, February 16th, the day before Geneva talks began, Araghchi met Grossi in Geneva. A photograph released by the Iranian Foreign Ministry showed both men appearing professionally composed. Araghchi posted on X that he arrived with real ideas to achieve a fair and equitable deal. What was not on the table, he wrote, was submission before threats. Tehran would negotiate but not capitulate. It would discuss terms but not accept preconditions. It would talk peace while demonstrating war. President Trump, speaking Monday night aboard Air Force One returning to Washington, calibrated his messaging with characteristic directness. I will be involved in those talks, indirectly, and they will be very important, and we will see what can happen, Trump told reporters. He then assessed Iran as bad negotiators, because we could have had a deal instead of sending the B-2s in to knock out their nuclear potential, and we had to send the B-2s. That reference to Operation Midnight Hammer, the June 2025 strikes using B-2 Spirit stealth bombers dropping GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators on Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan, served as a reminder that military action had already occurred and could occur again. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, speaking to reporters during his visit to Hungary on Monday, stated that the president always prefers peaceful outcomes and negotiated outcomes to things, But that preference for peaceful outcomes existed alongside 2 carrier strike groups, 60 combat aircraft, dozens of destroyers, and recently replenished bunker-buster munitions converging on the region simultaneously. Iran demanded negotiations focus exclusively on nuclear issues, explicitly excluding ballistic missiles and its regional proxy network. Iranian state TV confirmed Tuesday that talks would be indirect and address only the nuclear program, not domestic policies, including the protest crackdown that killed at least 7 out of 15 people. The human rights activists' news agency, consistently accurate in counting casualties during previous Iranian unrest and relying on a network of activists inside the country, provided that latest death toll. One of the deadliest periods occurred in a single night between January 8th and 9th, 2026. Iran was marking 40 days since that night on Tuesday, the traditional Muslim mourning period, with state media announcing a government memorial at the Grand Mosalla Mosque in Tehran. See an adversary willing to board individual ships and willing to close the entire strait represented a different category of maritime risk than one demonstrating only one of those capabilities. Vessel owners, charterers, and insurers working through the implications recognized that the Hormuz risk premium they had been pricing since early February had been underestimated. The operational reality Iran demonstrated Tuesday was more severe than market assumptions had incorporated. The Geneva talks lasted approximately 2 hours and 50 minutes, according to Iranian state media reporting that negotiations ended after almost 3 hours. The indirect format meant American and Iranian representatives never sat in the same room. Omani mediators shuttled between delegations, carrying proposals and counter-proposals through the same back-channel architecture used in Muscat. Iran would discuss enrichment levels and verification mechanisms, but refused halting enrichment entirely, which Washington considered a prerequisite for meaningful agreement. America would discuss sanctions relief, but refused lifting all sanctions without verified compliance, which Tehran considered prerequisite for continued engagement. The fundamental incompatibility of core positions meant even skillful Omani mediation could not bridge the gap in a single session. No follow-up meetings were announced publicly when the talks concluded. Gulf Arab nations watching these developments saw their worst fears partially realized. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, and Qatar had collectively urged restraint for weeks, understanding that any conflict would damage the entire regional economy. The UAE, whose port at Khor served as a critical transshipment hub downstream from Hormuz, faced direct economic exposure to sustained closures. Saudi Arabia, whose Ras Tanura terminal represented the world's largest oil export facility, understood that Iranian disruption of Hormuz traffic directly threatened Saudi revenues. Qatar, simultaneously hosting 10,000 American troops at Al Udeid Air Base and providing diplomatic infrastructure for negotiations through Omani channels, faced surreal complexity as its military partners operated warships in the waters where Iranian missiles were being fired during talks its networks had helped facilitate. For American military commanders, the simultaneous Geneva talks and Hormuz missile launches created operationally familiar but politically constrained conditions. USS Abraham Lincoln and advance elements of USS Gerald R. Ford's strike group represented overwhelming conventional superiority in the region, but superiority does not automatically translate into freedom of action when an adversary actively contests specific choke points, when regional allies have counseled restraint, and when political leadership is simultaneously pursuing diplomacy in the same news cycle as military demonstrations. The IRGC exercises marked the second live-fire drill in the Strait in recent weeks. The first had occurred without announcing a strait closure. Tuesday's escalation from exercises to actual closure made the implicit explicit. Iran was not just practicing tactical capabilities. It was executing a strategic communication through military action, demonstrating to every government watching that Hormuz closure was operational policy ready for implementation, not rhetorical threat. The international diplomatic context added further complexity. Geneva on Tuesday simultaneously hosted American-facilitated discussions between Russian and Ukrainian envoys for ceasefire talks, with sessions scheduled Tuesday and Wednesday, ahead of the 4th anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The Trump administration was pursuing multiple major diplomatic initiatives simultaneously, deploying maximum pressure, combined with willingness to deal across both Eastern Europe and the Middle East. Critics argued pursuing Iran nuclear talks alongside Ukraine ceasefire discussions created opportunities for adversaries to coordinate, with Russia potentially providing diplomatic support to Tehran, while American strategic attention was divided. Supporters countered that demonstrating simultaneous engagement on multiple fronts projected capability that sequential single-issue diplomacy could not achieve. The assessment gaining widest acceptance among intelligence analysts was that Iran was executing coercive diplomacy in its most aggressive contemporary form. The doctrine required demonstrating military cost imposition at the precise moment diplomatic engagement occurred, ensuring negotiating counterparts understood exactly what alternatives to agreement would produce. North Korea had employed similar tactics, timing missile tests to coincide with diplomatic engagements to remind negotiators what failure would mean. But Iran's Tuesday execution was particularly integrated and precise. The strait closure was not a threat. It was an actual physical closing, documented by maritime tracking services, confirmed by shipping companies rerouting vessels, and broadcast on Iranian state television during the exact hours Araghchi sat with Omani mediators in Geneva. The trap Khamenei had set was elegant in its logic. If America wanted Araghchi to remain at the negotiating table, it could not immediately respond militarily to the Hormuz closure without destroying the diplomatic process it claimed to prefer. If America did not respond, Iran demonstrated that coercive behavior during negotiations carried no immediate cost. Either outcome served Iranian strategic interests. Commercial shipping companies updated risk assessments within hours and began examining whether Gulf voyages required additional crew compensation, additional insurance coverage, or alternative routings. The Fujairah anchorage in the UAE, serving as primary alternative to Hormuz transits, reported increased inquiry from vessels seeking positions outside the closure zone. Saudi Arabia's east-west pipeline, capable of carrying up to 5 million barrels daily from Abqaiq to the Red Sea, received evaluation inquiries from operators, assessing whether overland capacity could handle diverted volumes if closures became sustained. These operational adjustments, made within hours of Tuesday's announcement, demonstrated how quickly commercial shipping adapted to Iran, having made strait status uncertain in ways it never had been before. Oil market response reflected actuarial calculation about closure probability rather than immediate panic. Traders who had long assigned relatively low probability to sustained Hormuz closure, perhaps 5 to 10% in extreme scenarios, updated those assessments significantly upward after Tuesday. If Iran was willing to close the strait even temporarily during ongoing nuclear negotiations, what was the probability of sustained closure if those negotiations ultimately failed? That probability revision, multiplied across global oil trading positions worth hundreds of billions of dollars, generated price movements exceeding what the temporary closure itself directly justified. Markets were pricing not just Tuesday's closure, but the information Tuesday provided about Iranian willingness to act. That information changed fundamental assumptions about risk floors in Middle East energy markets for months ahead. The broader strategic implications extended beyond the immediate U.S.-Iran confrontation. Every nation with economic interests in Persian Gulf energy flows, from Japan and South Korea importing approximately 70% of their oil through Hormuz, to European nations dependent on Gulf liquefied natural gas supplies, now had to incorporate into their planning a scenario previously treated as extreme and unlikely. Iran had demonstrated that a government could simultaneously engage diplomatically and militarily, using each track to reinforce the other rather than treating them as mutually exclusive. The diplomatic track provided political cover, making immediate military retaliation difficult to justify internationally. The military track provided leverage, making diplomatic concessions more attractive than the alternative. Understanding that this dual track could be sustained indefinitely required updating fundamental assumptions about how Iran would behave in future negotiations and future crises. The economic warfare dimension of the U.S.-Iran confrontation operated in parallel with military and diplomatic tracks, creating pressure on both sides that shaped their negotiating calculations. American sanctions had dramatically reduced Iran's oil revenues, contributing to the currency collapse and hyperinflation that triggered the December 2025 and January 2026 protests. The rial had lost over 90% of its value against the dollar since maximum pressure sanctions were reimposed in 2018. Ordinary Iranians paid inflation rates exceeding 40% annually for basic goods. The protests that killed 7,015 people were fundamentally economic in origin, driven by desperation among working-class Iranians whose wages had been devastated by currency collapse, while regime-connected elites maintained access to hard currency through corruption. Khamenei understood that sustained economic pressure, if it continued driving protests, threatened the regime's survival more fundamentally than any military threat. This gave Iran's supreme leader powerful incentive to reach a deal that provided sanctions relief while maintaining sufficient face-saving conditions to satisfy domestic hardliners. The nuclear talks in Geneva were not purely about nuclear weapons. They were about whether the Iranian regime could survive the economic consequences of continued international isolation. For the Trump administration, the economic leverage was equally central to strategic calculations. American officials had spent weeks in February publicly discussing the possibility of military strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities. But strikes carried costs that sanctions did not. Military action would trigger Iranian retaliation against American forces and regional allies, potentially closing Hormuz through hostile action rather than controlled demonstration, destabilizing multiple regional governments, and creating domestic political pressures in the United States if casualties resulted. Sustained sanctions pressure, by contrast, was already producing results. The protests demonstrated that economic pain was reaching levels threatening regime stability. If sanctions could topple the Islamic Republic without military strikes, the strategic outcome would be superior to anything military action could achieve. But that calculation required patience and nerve. Sanctions pressure created Iranian incentives to negotiate, but also created Iranian incentives to accelerate nuclear development as leverage and deterrence, creating a race between economic collapse and nuclear capability that made timing critical. The Omani mediation that made Geneva talks possible reflected a decades-long diplomatic tradition of Oman serving as back-channel facilitator between Washington and Tehran. Oman had hosted preliminary discussions that preceded the 2013 breakthrough, leading eventually to the 2015 JCPOA. Omani Sultan Haytham bin Tariq maintained functional relationships with both American and Iranian leadership, providing the credibility necessary to be trusted by both sides as an honest broker. The logistics of indirect talks, where American and Iranian delegations occupied separate rooms with Omani mediators moving between them, reflected the political reality that direct bilateral talks were impossible, given the absence of diplomatic relations between Washington and Tehran since the 1979 hostage crisis. This format imposed costs on efficiency. Nuance was inevitably lost in translation and transmission between rooms. Positions hardened in ways that direct dialogue might have softened. But the format was what both sides could accept, and imperfect engagement was better than no engagement given the alternative of military confrontation. As the day concluded with talks ended, missiles fired, strait temporarily closed, and no agreement announced, the fundamental question defining U.S.-Iran relations for decades remained as unanswered as ever. Would Tehran accept verifiable constraints on its nuclear program in exchange for sanctions relief and reduction of military pressure? Or would the coercive dual track of diplomacy and military demonstration continue until either a deal was struck or confrontation became unavoidable? Tuesday's events suggested Iran believed it could sustain this approach indefinitely, using the strait as leverage and the negotiating table as cover while maintaining strategic ambiguity about ultimate nuclear intentions. The trap Khamenei had set was simultaneously a military demonstration, a diplomatic engagement, an economic calculation, and a domestic political performance. All four dimensions served Iranian strategic interests simultaneously. Military demonstrations showed capability. Diplomatic engagement showed reasonableness to international audiences. Economic calculations drove both sides toward deals neither wanted to make. Domestic performance maintained hardliner support for a regime under unprecedented internal pressure. Understanding Khamenei's trap required seeing all four dimensions simultaneously rather than analyzing any one in isolation. Whether that trap would capture the diplomatic outcome Tehran sought or eventually trigger the military response it was designed to deter remained the question on which the security of an entire region and the flow of 20 million barrels of daily oil supply depended. The missiles had struck their targets in Hormuz. The diplomats had exchanged proposals in Geneva, and neither side had moved meaningfully closer to the accommodation that alone could resolve a crisis growing more dangerous with each passing week.